October 21, 1422. The Hotel St. Paul in Paris. A dying king whispers the same name through cracked, feverish lips. Odette, Odette, over and over, as death circles closer. But here's what transforms this deathbed scene into something truly nightmarish. Odette wasn't his wife. She wasn't even a noblewoman. She was a teenage girl who had spent 15 years pretending to be the Queen of France, while the real queen stayed as far from her husband as the castle walls would allow. And the king, Charles VI of France, died never knowing the difference. This is the final chapter of a reign that lasted 42 years, but for 30 of those years the monarch who ruled one of Europe's most powerful nations believed with absolute conviction that his body was made of glass. Not as a metaphor, not as poetry. Charles VI literally refused to let anyone touch him because he was convinced that human contact would shatter his body into 1,000 fragments, like a wine goblet dropped on stone floors. Mental illness destroying a monarch isn't unprecedented in the blood-soaked pages of European history. What makes Charles's descent into madness so utterly terrifying is how his fractured mind did just destroy him. It nearly obliterated France itself. While their king cowered in shadowed corners, paralyzed by the fear of breaking like porcelain, English armies carved through French territories like scythes through wheat. While he ran naked through palace corridors, howling like a wolf at invisible threats, his own family members butchered each other in the streets of Paris, turning cobblestones red with royal blood. And while he sat frozen for days at a time, convinced that even the slightest movement would cause him to explode into crystalline shards, his advisors signed treaties that handed his kingdom to England on a silver platter. But let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began, because Charles VI wasn't born into madness. For the first 24 years of his life, his subjects knew him as Charles the Beloved. The transformation from beloved king to the man who believed he was a living, breathing piece of glasswork happened in one specific, horrifying moment on a scorching August day in 1392. And it started with a barefoot leper, grabbing the reins of the king's horse and screaming prophecies of betrayal. Picture this scene like a fever dream crystallizing into terrible reality. August 1392. King Charles VI is leading a military expedition through a dense forest near Le Mans. The heat is oppressive, the kind that turns armor into an oven and makes horses foam at the mouth from exhaustion. Charles had recently recovered from a fever, and his advisors had practically begged him to postpone this campaign against Pierre de Crone, a nobleman who had attempted to assassinate one of the king's closest counselors. But Charles insisted with an urgency that seemed almost manic. One chronicler would later write that he seemed to be in a fever to begin, as though something invisible was pulling him toward his fate. The royal procession is massive, a serpent of knights, soldiers, and servants winding through the forest in ceremonial formation. Then, without warning, a figure emerges from between the trees like an apparition. A barefoot man dressed in rags, his skin marked with the telltale signs of leprosy, runs directly at the king's horse and seizes the bridle with filthy hands. "Ride no further, noble king," he shouts, his voice cracking with desperation. "Turn back, you are betrayed." The guards beat him back with the hilts of their swords, but here's the deeply unsettling part. They don't arrest him. They don't even properly chase him away. For the next half hour, this ragged prophet follows the procession like a specter of doom, shouting his warnings over and over until his voice goes hoarse. "Turn back, you are betrayed. Turn back before it's too late." The company finally emerges from the forest around noon, and the sun hangs directly overhead like a malevolent eye, beating down mercilessly on steel armor and exhausted horses. A drowsy page, probably half asleep in his saddle from the oppressive heat, accidentally drops the king's lance. The weapon clangs against another knight's helmet with a sharp metallic crash that echoes across the clearing like a gunshot. And that's the moment when Charles VI's mind shatters like the glass he would later believe himself to be. The king's body goes rigid, then begins shuddering violently. He draws his sword with terrifying speed and screams words that would echo through French history. "Forward against the traitors. They wish to deliver me to the enemy." Before anyone can react, before a single guard can process what's happening, Charles spurs his horse directly at his own men and begins swinging his sword with the intent to kill. The first knight doesn't even have time to raise his shield in defense. Charles's blade catches him in the neck, and blood sprays across the king's face in a crimson arc. But Charles doesn't stop. He doesn't even pause. He wheels his horse around with the skill of a trained warrior and charges again, his eyes wild and unseeing. The bastard of Polignac, one of the king's own trusted companions, tries desperately to calm him, calling out "Your Majesty" in a voice thick with panic. Charles runs him through without hesitation, the sword punching through armor and flesh like they're paper. For several minutes that must have felt like hours to the men trapped in that clearing, the King of France attempts to massacre his own army. Knights are screaming, horses are rearing and throwing their riders, men are diving into the underbrush to escape their sovereign's blade. Charles kills 4 of his own men outright and wounds several others, before his chamberlain and a group of soldiers finally manage to wrestle him from his horse. They pin him to the ground where he continues thrashing and screaming about traitors and enemies, his voice raw and inhuman, until suddenly he goes completely limp, as though someone has cut the strings holding a puppet upright. The king falls into a coma that lasts for days. When Charles finally wakes, he remembers nothing. Not the attack, not the expedition, not the deaths of his own men. He looks at the bandages wrapped around his hands where they were cut while trying to disarm him and asks with genuine confusion why they were there. When his advisors gather the courage to tell him what happened, Charles weeps uncontrollably, his body racked with sobs. This would be the first of 44 documented psychiatric episodes that would plague Charles VI until his final breath. Modern historians studying the medieval accounts suggest paranoid schizophrenia, possibly combined with bipolar disorder. Some point to his mother's family, the Bourbons, who carried a dark legacy of mental instability in their bloodline. But in 1392, in a world without psychiatry or psychology, all anyone knew was that their 24-year-old king had just tried to slaughter his own retinue in a forest clearing. And this horror, this absolute shattering of royal sanity, was just the beginning of France's long descent into nightmare. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of history, by the stories that textbooks often sanitize or skip entirely, please subscribe. These are the tales that deserve to be told in full, with all their tragedy and terror intact. Because history isn't just dates and battles. It's human beings facing unimaginable circumstances, and sometimes breaking under the weight. Not that he was blessed by the warrior saint, not that St. George was protecting him from some distant heaven, but that he literally was the dragon-slaying saint himself, somehow transported into 15th century France. He insisted that his coat of arms had mysteriously changed to show a lion with a sword thrust through its body. He would spend hours drawing this imaginary crest with meticulous detail, showing it to confused courtiers who didn't dare contradict their mad king, even as they exchanged worried glances behind his back. Yet even this delusion of sainthood paled compared to what began around 1405. The delusion that would make Charles VI infamous throughout European history and beyond. The king became absolutely unshakably convinced that his entire body was made of glass, not just his bones, not just certain parts of himself, but everything. Charles believed he was a living, breathing, thinking piece of glasswork that could shatter at any moment. The future Pope Pius II would later write about Charles in terms that mixed clinical observation with profound pity. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass and would not let himself be touched. He had iron rods put into his clothing and protected himself in all sorts of ways so that he might not fall and break. Think about the absolute, consuming terror of existing in this delusion for just a moment. Every movement becomes potentially fatal. Every gesture from another person transforms into an existential threat. Charles would sit completely motionless for hours, sometimes stretching into days, afraid that even shifting his weight might cause him to explode into fragments. Servants reported finding him frozen in place, tears streaming silently down his face, whispering the same words over and over like a prayer. "Don't touch me. I'll break into 1,000 pieces." The king had iron rods sewn into all his clothes as reinforcement, turning his wardrobe into a kind of portable cage. Imagine the sound of metal clicking and scraping with every tiny movement he managed to make. He wore multiple layers of padding underneath, desperately trying to protect what he believed was his glass body from the slightest impact. If a servant accidentally brushed against him while serving food or adjusting his chair, Charles would scream in pure terror and examine himself frantically for cracks, running his hands over his arms and chest, searching for the fractures he was certain must be spreading through his crystalline flesh. The most heartbreaking detail, the one that cuts through centuries of historical distance, is this. During his increasingly rare lucid periods, Charles knew something was terribly wrong with his mind. He would weep and beg God to either cure him or grant him death. "I am the most wretched of all men," he once told his confessor, his voice barely audible. "I bring misery to all who love me." But even in his madness, even as he sat paralyzed by the delusion that he was made of glass, Charles was still technically king, and the court still tried desperately to function around his episodes, to maintain some semblance of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation, while Charles sat frozen in his chambers, terrified of his own fragility. Two of the most powerful dukes in France were locked in a rivalry so intense, so consuming, that it would tear the kingdom apart at its seams. On one side stood Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, the same man who had nearly burned Charles alive at the Ball of the Burning Men back in 1393. Louis was handsome, charismatic, and almost certainly sleeping with Queen Isabeau, though the rumors were never definitively proven. On the other side stood John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the king's cousin, a cold and calculating man who believed that France should be his to rule, that his bloodline and his strength gave him the right to power that the mad king could no longer wield. The hatred between Orleans and Burgundy went far beyond normal court politics or aristocratic rivalry. They actively, deliberately, sabotaged each other's policies at every opportunity. When one raised taxes to fund military campaigns, the other would publicly promise to lower them. When one forged an alliance with a foreign power, the other would secretly work to break it. France wasn't being governed during these years. It was being pulled apart by two ambitious men who each wanted to be the power behind the glass throne. On November 23, 1407, this simmering conflict exploded into blood and murder. Louis of Orleans had just finished dining with Queen Isabeau at her residence. It was a cold night, the kind where breath turns to mist and frost creeps across cobblestones. Louis pulled his cloak tight as he mounted his horse to return to his own mansion, accompanied by just a handful of servants carrying torches to light the way through Paris's dark streets. As they passed through the narrow Rue Vieille temple, armed men emerged from the shadows like demons materializing from hell itself. The Duke of Orleans, one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the night, "Kill him!" Louis tried to run, spurring his horse forward, but there were too many attackers. 15 men with swords and axes, professionals who knew their bloody work well. They dragged him from his horse and an axe split his skull in two with a sound that witnesses would never forget. But the attackers didn't stop there. They continued hacking at his body even after he was clearly obviously dead, cutting off his hands and smashing his face beyond any possibility of recognition. Blood ran in the gutters like rainwater while his servants fled, screaming into the night, their torches casting wild shadows on the walls. The next morning, all of Paris knew who was responsible. John the Fearless didn't even attempt to deny his involvement. Instead, he hired a theologian to write an elaborate justification for the murder, a treatise arguing that Louis had been a tyrant who deserved death for the good of France. John stood before the royal court and not only admitted but bragged that he had ordered his cousin's assassination, that he had done what needed to be done to save the kingdom. And what did the mad king do when confronted with his brother's murder? Charles VI, in one of his increasingly rare lucid moments, forgave John the Fearless. Whether he truly understood that his brother had been brutally assassinated in the streets, or whether he was too lost in his glass delusion to fully grasp the horror of what had happened, we will never know. But that forgiveness, that failure to seek justice, launched France into civil war. The years that followed saw Frenchmen slaughtering Frenchmen in the streets while their king sat motionless in his chambers, too terrified of shattering to move. And while France burned from within, a young English king named Henry V was watching from across the Channel. Henry realized something that would change European history. France was so divided, so utterly leaderless that England could actually conquer it. On October 25, 1415, at a muddy field near the village of Agincourt, the French nobility died in the thousands, cut down by English arrows, while their mad king remained in Rouen, completely unaware that the battle determining his kingdom's fate was even taking place. The cream of French aristocracy drowned in mud and their own blood while Charles sat in the darkened room, whispering about glass and fragility. By October 1422, Charles VI was dying. He had reigned for 42 years, but he had truly ruled for perhaps only 12 of them. The rest had been madness, terror, and a kingdom slowly bleeding to death. In his final days, he called repeatedly for Odette, the young woman who had pretended to be his queen because the real Queen Isabeau could unbear to be near him anymore. He died believing she was Isabeau, died without ever knowing that even this final comfort was an illusion. Charles VI, who had once been called the beloved, passed from the world thinking he was made of glass, surrounded by people pretending to be someone they weren't in a kingdom that had shattered just as thoroughly as he always feared he would. What do you think haunts you most about Charles's story? The tragedy of a mind destroying itself, or the way an entire kingdom fell apart because one man's sanity crumbled? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.